The bread was already 2 days old. Grace knew it the moment her fingers pressed against the crust. That familiar resistance, the dryness that crumbled at the edges like old parchment. She wrapped it carefully in a square of rough linen anyway, the way she always did, as if the wrapping itself could make it something better than what it was. The kitchen was still dark at that hour. The fire in the great hearth reduced to trembling embers that threw copper shadows across the stone floor. Outside, the wind moved through the valley like something alive, pressing against the wooden shutters with low, insistent groans. She was the first one awake. She always was. The Ashford estate sat at the edge of the Northern Territory, far enough from the pack's central lands that the cold arrived earlier and stayed longer. By the time the first frost came each year, Grace had already learned to sleep in her woolen underdress rather than change into it in the morning. Warmth was a luxury she planned for. So was food. She tucked the wrapped bread under her arm, lifted the wooden bucket from its hook beside the door, and stepped outside into the gray morning. The cold hit her immediately. Not the gentle chill of autumn's end, but the hard, particular cold of a territory that had already decided winter was coming whether anyone was ready or not. The ground beneath her boots was stiff with frost, each step producing a quiet crunch. Her breath came out in pale ribbons. She pulled the gray wool cloak tighter around her shoulders with her free hand and walked toward the well at the far end of the yard, eyes half closed against the wind. She almost missed him. He was sitting with his back against the stone wall that separated the estate yard from the old road, the wall that was supposed to keep strangers out. He had found a narrow notch in it, a place where 2 large stones left a gap just wide enough for a thin man to wedge himself sideways. He had done exactly that, pulling his knees to his chest, his whole body curved inward as if trying to occupy as little space as possible in the world. Grace stopped walking. He was old. That was the first thing she registered. Old in the way of a man who had once been very large and strong, and was now simply worn. The way a great tree looks after years of hard weather, still rooted but stripped of something. His cloak was dark with road dirt, the hem ragged, one of the clasps at the throat missing entirely so the fabric hung open despite the cold. His boots were cracked leather, the left one bound with a strip of cloth where the sole had begun to separate. His white hair, thick and long, was tangled with leaves and dust from travel. But it was his hands that made her chest tighten. They were resting on his knees, open and upward, the way a man holds his hands when he has stopped pretending, when he has simply decided to wait and see what the world will do next. Grace looked back at the house. The windows were dark. No one else was awake. No one would know. She crossed the yard toward him. He heard her coming. She could tell because his shoulders shifted slightly, a small bracing motion. The motion of a man who had learned to expect the worst from approaching footsteps. "You're going to freeze," she said. It came out more plainly than she intended, more like an observation than a greeting. She crouched down to his level without thinking. The bucket handle hooked over her wrist, the wrapped bread still under her arm. He looked at her. His eyes were sharp, startlingly so, dark and clear beneath white brows, carrying in them something that didn't match the ruin of his clothing at all. It was the look of a man accustomed to being looked at rather than looked over. A man who had once stood somewhere very high. "I've been colder," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. A voice with no apology in it. "That isn't something to be proud of," Grace replied. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. She held out the wrapped bread. He looked at it for a moment without moving. Then he looked at her again, and this time she had the strange sensation of being seen. Not assessed, not pitied, not dismissed. Simply seen. The way very few people had ever bothered to look at her. "I don't take charity," he said. "It's 2-day-old bread," she said. "It isn't charity. It's bread I was going to have to feed to the goats." A pause. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of pine from the dark forest line beyond the road. He took it. She watched him eat, slowly, deliberately, the way a man eats when he is hungry, but refuses to let hunger be the thing that controls him. He broke the bread into pieces with careful hands. He chewed without rush. There was a dignity to it that made her feel oddly like the lesser person in the exchange, which was not something she was accustomed to feeling when giving something away. "Where are you traveling from?" she asked, settling back on her heels. "Far," he said simply. "And toward?" He considered that for a moment longer than the question seemed to warrant. "The Iron Veil Keep," he said at last. Grace went very still. Iron Veil Keep. The seat of the Alpha King. The place that sat like a dark crown above the whole of the northern and eastern territories, its stone walls visible from 3 valleys away on a clear day. A place that common people spoke of in low voices, if they spoke of it at all. "That's a hard road for a man alone," she said carefully. "Most good roads are." She studied him. There was something in the line of his jaw, the way he held the base of his spine straight, even pressed against a cold wall, that nagged at her like a familiar melody she couldn't place. "Do you have family there? At the keep?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the bread in his hands. "I have a son there," he said. Though whether he'll want to see me is another matter entirely, the heaviness in those words was unmistakable. Grace had heard grief before. In all its shapes and forms, she had heard it in kitchens and corridors and late-night whispers through thin walls. But this was something specific. Not the grief of loss, the grief of distance chosen, of years allowed to pass. "Fathers and sons," she said quietly. "It's rarely simple." "No," he agreed. "It rarely is." She stood, brushing frost from the hem of her cloak. Her bucket was still empty, the well still waiting. The house behind her would wake soon, and with it the sharp voice of the head steward and the long list of tasks that shaped every hour of her day from gray dawn to gray night. "There's a barn at the east end of this property," she said, not looking at him. "The side door doesn't latch properly. The hay is dry and the draft horses run warm. It would be a better place to sleep than a wall gap if you have no coin for the inn at the crossroads." She picked up her bucket and walked toward the well without waiting for his response. She was halfway there when she heard him speak again, his voice carrying calmly over the wind. "What is your name, girl?" She glanced back over her shoulder. "Grace." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected something like that. As if the name confirmed something he'd already suspected. "My name is Edmund," he said. She turned back to the well. It was a plain name, a common name. There was absolutely no reason for the back of her neck to prickle the way it did. She drew the water and went back inside. She did not think about him again until 3 days later, when 6 riders in black leather and iron crests appeared at the gate of the Ashford estate, and the man leading them had dark braided hair, ice-pale eyes, and a face carved like winter itself. He was not looking at the gate. He was looking directly at her. Grace was carrying a basket of folded linens when the riders came through the gate. She heard them before she saw them. The heavy, rhythmic percussion of hooves on frozen ground. 6 horses moving in tight formation. The kind of disciplined approach that didn't belong to merchants or messengers. She stepped out of the side corridor into the main yard, just as the gate swung open, and the cold morning air rushed in ahead of them like an announcement. The horses were black. Not the ordinary dark brown that people called black. These were true black, the color of deep water at night, their coats gleaming even under the flat gray sky. Their tack was iron and leather, stamped with a crest she recognized immediately despite never having been close to it before. A wolf's head inside a circle of jagged peaks, the mark of Iron Veil Keep, the mark of the Alpha King. Grace stopped walking. The riders fanned out as they entered the yard, taking positions along the fence line with the practiced ease of men who had done this in 100 different courtyards. They wore black leather chest plates over dark tunics, iron bracers on their forearms, short swords at their hips. Their faces were impassive, scanning the estate grounds with cold professional attention. And then the last rider came through the gate. He was taller than the others, broader through the shoulders, riding a horse that was larger than the rest by at least a hand's span. His hair was black and braided close to his skull at the temples, the rest falling in thick plaits past his shoulders. He wore layered leather armor across his chest, crossed with heavy straps and buckles, a manto of black fur resting across his shoulders, like something he'd taken from a wolf and decided to keep. His forearms were bare despite the cold, wrapped only in dark leather bracers studded with iron. His eyes found her before she had time to look away. They were the color of deep winter ice. Not blue exactly, but the particular shade that exists at the center of a glacier, where the cold has been compressing itself for so long it has become something beyond mere color. They were sharp and still and completely, unsettlingly direct. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he was already searching for. Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the linen basket. She made herself hold his gaze for exactly one breath before dropping her eyes, the way every servant in every territory knew to do when someone of rank looked at them directly. It was reflex. It was survival. But in that single breath, she had seen something in his expression that she couldn't name. Not anger. Not indifference. Something more complicated than either. The head steward, Perrin, came scurrying out of the main house with the particular speed of a man who has just been informed that very important people have arrived and is deeply unhappy about it. He was a narrow man with a sparse gray beard and the permanent expression of someone smelling something slightly unpleasant, and he was already bowing before he had fully cleared the doorway. "My lord," he said, addressing the dark-haired rider. "We had no word of your visit. The estate is honored." "I'm not here for the estate," the man said. His voice was low and even, carrying the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume. He had not looked away from Grace. "I'm here for her." The yard went silent. Grace felt the weight of every pair of eyes shift toward her. The riders, the steward, the two stable hands who had frozen in the middle of their morning work, a curry comb suspended uselessly in one young man's hand. She felt the particular, familiar sensation of being the smallest and most exposed person in a given space, which was a feeling she had known most of her life. She lifted her chin. "I am Grace," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "A maid in service to the Ashford household. If I have done something to cause offense to the keep, my lord, I would ask to know what it is." Something passed across his face. Still not anger. She studied him quickly, trying to map the geography of his expression, and found it harder to read than almost anyone she had ever looked at. It was a face that had learned to show very little. He dismounted. He was even larger on the ground. He moved with a controlled deliberateness, handing his reins to the nearest rider without looking at the man, his eyes staying on Grace as he crossed the yard toward her. The frozen ground crunched under his boots. He stopped a few paces away, close enough for conversation, far enough to not be threatening, though the distinction felt academic given who he was. "3 days ago," he said, "you gave food and shelter to an old man on the road." It was not a question. Grace felt the understanding arrive slowly, the way cold water rises, first at the edges, then all at once. Edmund. The old man with the sharp eyes and the open hands. The man who had eaten 2-day-old bread with more dignity than most lords ate their feasts. The man who had told her he was traveling to Ironvale Keep to see his son. His son. She looked at the man standing before her, at the line of his jaw, the particular set of his dark brows, the way he held his spine straight as if the concept of slouching had never occurred to him. And she saw it. Clearly and suddenly. The way you see a shape in a dark room the moment someone brings a candle close. The eyes were different, but everything else. Edmund, she said quietly. Not a confirmation. Just the name, placed carefully in the air between them. Something in the Alpha King's face shifted. Barely. A tightening at the corners of his eyes that could have been anything, but that Grace somehow understood was not nothing. His name, the man said, is Edmund Voss. He is my father, and he arrived at Iron Vale Keep yesterday morning, half frozen and travel-worn, because he had spent 3 days walking a road in winter that he should not have been on alone. A pause. He told me what you did. Grace waited. He said a girl named Grace fed him bread she called worthless, and showed him to a warm place to sleep, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. His voice had not changed in pitch or tone, but there was something underneath it now, something running beneath the surface like a current beneath ice. He said she didn't ask who he was, or what he had. He said she looked at his hands. Grace's throat tightened unexpectedly. She had not known she was being seen so precisely in that moment. She had simply done what seemed necessary. Anyone would have, she began. No, he said, and the single word was flat and certain and left no room for argument. They would not. He studied her for a long moment. Around them, the wind moved through the yard, stirring the dead leaves caught against the fence posts, carrying the distant smell of pine smoke from the village beyond the ridge. I have come to repay what was given, he said. My father asked me to find you. He asked me to bring you to Iron Vale Keep, where you will be given a position in the household appropriate to someone who showed kindness to a member of the king's family. Grace stared at him. The head steward made a soft, strangled sound somewhere behind her. She stopped. Started again. I am in service here. I have obligations to this household. Your obligations, the Alpha King said, and the word carried a weight that made it clear he found the concept mildly interesting, will be transferred. He glanced at the steward with an expression that communicated, very efficiently, that this was not a negotiation. Grace looked down at the basket of folded linens in her arms. The rough linen, the careful folds she had pressed into the fabric that morning, the same way she pressed them every morning, the same way she would press them every morning for the rest of her foreseeable life if she stayed here. She looked back up. The Alpha King was still watching her. Those ice-pale eyes, patient and unreadable. Why would your father ask for me specifically? She said. He doesn't know me. We spoke for 10 minutes in a cold yard. The corner of his mouth moved. It was so small a motion that she almost missed it entirely. He said, the Alpha King replied slowly, that you were the first person in a long time who looked at him like he was simply a man. The words landed somewhere deep in her chest. She tightened her grip on the basket of linens. She thought of cold mornings, of bread that was always 2 days old, of a life shaped entirely by the needs of others, and bounded on every side by walls she had not chosen. I'll need an hour to gather my things, she said. The road to Iron Vale Keep took 2 days. Grace had never ridden a horse before, not properly, not with saddle and stirrup, and the long rolling gait of a trained animal beneath her. She had sat on the back of a cart horse once, as a child, for approximately 30 seconds before the stable master had lifted her down with a sharp word about animals not being toys. That was the full extent of her experience. She did not mention this. She was given a gray mare with a calm temperament and a steady walk, and she settled into the saddle with the particular focus of someone who has decided that whatever discomfort they are experiencing is entirely manageable and will not be spoken of aloud. Her gray wool cloak spread across the horse's flanks. Her single bag of belongings, a change of dress, a spare pair of wool stockings, a small tin of dried herbs she used for headaches, and a leather-bound book of herb lore that had belonged to her mother was secured behind the saddle. She rode near the middle of the formation. The Alpha King rode ahead. He did not speak to her for the entirety of the first day. This was fine. Grace was accustomed to silence. She had lived most of her adult life in the particular silence of service, the kind that exists not because there is nothing to say, but because the people around you have collectively decided that what you might say does not need to be heard. She had learned to be comfortable in it, to use it, to observe from within it the way a hawk observes from height. So she observed. Kale. She had heard one of the riders address him by name on the first hour of the road, and the name had settled in her mind with a kind of quiet finality, rode with a stillness that she found unusual in a man of his evident physical power. Most large men moved with a certain unconscious aggression, occupying space in ways that announced their presence constantly. He was different. He was controlled in a way that suggested the stillness was a choice, not a default. That underneath it, something moved constantly, something alert and watchful, and never fully at rest. Once, in the late afternoon of the first day, she saw him turn his head slightly toward the tree line to the east, just his head, nothing else. His hand moved fractionally toward the short sword at his hip, then stilled. None of the riders around her seemed to notice, but she noticed, and 30 seconds later, she heard it, the distant crack of a branch in the forest, too heavy for a bird, too deliberate for the wind. Something large, moving parallel to their path. He had heard it before she did, long before. She filed this away without comment. They stopped at dusk in a way station, a low stone building maintained for the keep's riders, stocked with wood and dried provisions and rough wool blankets. The riders set their horses and built a fire, the smell of pine smoke filling the small space quickly, cutting through the cold that had been pressing down on them all day. Grace helped without being asked, carrying wood, filling the iron pot with water from the way station's covered well, hanging it over the fire with the pragmatic efficiency of someone for whom useful work is simply the natural response to an empty hour. She felt the Alpha King watching her from across the fire. She did not look up. "You don't have to do that," said a voice near her elbow. She turned. One of the riders, a young man, perhaps 20, with a freckled face and the kind of open expression that didn't entirely fit the company he kept, was looking at her with a slightly uncertain air. You're not in service to us. You're a guest." Grace looked at the pot of water she had just hung over the fire. She looked at the young rider. "The pot needed hanging," she said simply. "My hands were free." He blinked. Then, as if he hadn't entirely meant to, he smiled. "I'm Corin," he said. "I've ridden with the King's Guard for 2 years." "Grace," she replied. "I know." He glanced toward his king, and then back at her, and she noticed the way his voice dropped slightly, without him seeming to notice it himself. "The old lord, Edmund, he talked about you, when he arrived at the keep." He paused, seeming to consider how much to say. He doesn't talk much, usually, about anything, so when he did, people listened. Grace looked at the fire. The water was beginning to tremble in the pot, small bubbles forming at the bottom. "What did he say?" Corin was quiet for a moment. "He said you reminded him of someone he used to know." He shifted his weight. "He didn't say who." She turned that over in her mind, examining it the way she examined everything, carefully, from multiple angles, without rushing toward a conclusion. An old man who moved like someone who had once stood very high, who carried grief in his words when he spoke of his son, who looked at a maid in a frost-covered yard and said she reminded him of someone from before whatever had placed that grief in him. She was still thinking about it when the Alpha King sat down on the bench across the fire from her, not close, not far, simply present in the way that large, quiet things are present. and the firelight moved across the planes of his face and made him look, for just a moment, less like a king and more like a man who was very tired. "He spoke well of you," Cale said. He was looking at the fire, not at her. "He was kind to say so," Grace replied. "We barely spoke. He's a good judge." A pause. "He always was." The word was landed with a particular weight. Grace turned her tin cup in her hands, feeling the warmth of it through the metal. "How long has it been?" she asked. "Since you last saw him?" The fire snapped. One of the riders on the far side of the room coughed. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the stone walls with a sound like breathing. 7 years, Kyle said. She didn't ask why. It wasn't her place, and she understood instinctively that pressing would close something that had, very slightly, opened. Instead, she said, "He walked a winter road alone to find you." Cale was silent for a long moment. His jaw was tight. "I know. That's not nothing." He looked at her then, directly, the way he had looked at her in the yard of the Ashford estate, that unguarded, searching quality that seemed out of place on a face that was otherwise so carefully composed, as if he couldn't quite decide what she was, and found the uncertainty more interesting than alarming. "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." They didn't speak again that night. The keep revealed itself the following afternoon. Grace saw it first as a shape against the sky, dark and massive, sitting on the ridge above the valley like something that had grown there rather than been built. As they climbed the road toward it, details resolved themselves gradually. Walls of dark stone, thick as 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, towers at each corner flying black banners that moved slowly in the wind. The gates were iron, taller than 2 men, set into an archway carved with the wolf and mountain crest she had seen on the rider's armor. The village that clustered at the base of the keep's hill was larger than she'd expected. A proper settlement of stone and timber buildings. Market stalls shuttered against the cold. A blacksmith's fire visible through an open forge door, the smell of coal smoke and horse and baking bread mixing in the cold air. People moved through the narrow streets with the particular purposeful efficiency of those who live close to power and have learned to stay out of its way. They watched the riders pass with careful, neutral expressions. But when their eyes moved to Grace, to her plain gray cloak and simple linen dress and single bag of belongings, she saw something shift in a few of those faces. Curiosity. And in some, something harder. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like suspicion. She kept her spine straight and her eyes forward. The interior of the keep was vast and cold and smelled of stone and old wood and tallow candles. The walls hung with tapestries depicting hunts and battles in faded thread. A great staircase of dark oak rose from the entrance hall, its banister worn smooth by generations of hands. Torches burned in iron brackets along the corridors, throwing unsteady orange light across the flagstone floors. A woman was waiting at the base of the stairs. She was perhaps 40, lean and straight as a blade, with dark hair pulled severely from her face, and the kind of eyes that performed an inventory of everything they looked at. She wore a deep gray dress with a high collar, a ring of iron keys at her belt, and an expression of carefully maintained neutrality that Grace recognized immediately. This was a woman who ran things, who had opinions she rarely voiced, and a memory for every detail she had ever been given. "Mira," Cale said as they entered. "This is Grace. She'll need a room in the east wing, away from the servants' quarters." He removed his leather bracers as he spoke, handing them to a waiting attendant without looking at the boy. "And she's to have access to the household." Mira looked at Grace for exactly 3 seconds. "Of course, my lord," she said. But after Cale had moved past toward the stairs, Mira's gaze returned to Grace. And in the careful flatness of it, Grace read the unspoken question clearly. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" It was, Grace thought, a fair question. She offered Mira a small, direct nod. Not deferential, not challenging, simply present. The look of someone who has nothing to prove but also nothing to hide. Something in Mira's expression adjusted slightly. A recalibration. "I'll show you to your room," the older woman said. Edmund was in the library. Grace found out from Corin, who mentioned it the following morning with the slightly guilty air of someone sharing information they weren't entirely sure they should be sharing. The old lord spent most of his days in the library on the keep's second floor, he said. Had been doing so since he arrived. Hadn't asked for much. Ate what was brought to him. Slept in the chair more often than in the bed. Grace went to the library that afternoon. He was exactly where Corin had described, in a wide leather chair beside the window, a book open on his lap that he was not reading. He was looking out the window at the valley below, at the dark line of the forest and the pale sky above it, and his expression was the expression of a man reviewing something long and complicated in his mind. He looked up when she entered. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Edmund smiled. And it was the same smile she had almost seen in the frost-covered yard 3 days ago, the one that was quieter than a smile, but warmer. "Grace," he said. "You didn't tell me," she said. She sat down across from him without being invited, the way she had crouched to his level in the yard without being asked. "About who you were." "No," he agreed. "You let me give you old bread and a cold barn." "You offered both freely," he said. "Would you have offered them differently if you had known?" Grace considered this honestly. The truth was that she wasn't sure, and the uncertainty itself told her something about herself that she filed away carefully. "Your son came for me," she said. Edmund's expression shifted. The warmth in it deepened into something more complicated. "He came quickly," the old man said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like relief shaped around a wound. "That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" He looked at her steadily. "That he is still the man I raised," Edmund said. "Somewhere underneath everything they made him." The words settled in the room between them, heavy with history she didn't yet have access to. But she could feel the shape of it. The years, the distance, the thing that had broken between a father and his son and had been sitting broken for 7 years until an old man had decided to walk a winter road alone. "He doesn't smile much," Grace said quietly. "No," Edmund agreed. "He forgot how." He paused. Or he decided it was a luxury he couldn't afford. Outside the library window, snow had begun to fall, the first real snow of the season, coming down in slow and deliberate flakes that dissolved against the glass before they could accumulate. Grace watched it for a moment. "Why did you ask him to bring me here?" she said. Edmund was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps he wouldn't answer. Then he said simply, "Because kindness should not go unrewarded, and because—" He stopped. "Because?" She pressed gently. The old man looked at her with those sharp, clear eyes, and for just a moment, something moved in them that she couldn't name. Something between recognition and hope. "Because this keep has been cold for a very long time," he said, "and I thought perhaps it was time for that to change." Grace looked at the snow falling beyond the glass. She thought of the bread, of open hands, of a man who had looked at her like she was simply a person worth seeing. She thought of the Alpha King's face in the firelight the night before, tired and quiet, and briefly, unexpectedly human. She didn't know what Edmund meant, not fully, not yet, but she was beginning to understand that she was not here simply to be rewarded. She was here because something had already begun. The east wing was quieter than the rest of the keep, Grace learned this in her first few days. Learned it the way she learned everything in a new place, through careful observation and deliberate stillness. The east wing received the morning light first, the pale winter sun coming through the narrow windows in long flat angles that moved slowly across the stone floors as the day progressed. The corridor outside her room smelled of old wood and dried lavender, the latter coming from small bundles tied to the torch brackets at intervals, brown and brittle with age, but still faintly present. Someone had cared about this wing once. The attention showed in small details, the smoothness of the door handles, the quality of the tapestries, the way the fireplace in her room drew cleanly without smoking. She had a fireplace. She had not had a fireplace of her own in 11 years of service. She lit it every morning herself, not because there was no one to light it for her, but because the act of it, the striking of flint, the careful nursing of the first small flame, the moment when the wood caught and the warmth began to push back against the cold, felt important, like a small declaration, like saying, quietly, and to no one in particular, I am here. I intend to stay warm. She was making her bed on the fourth morning when Mira appeared in the doorway. The older woman watched her for a moment without speaking. Grace smoothed the wool blanket across the mattress, tucking the corners with the precise habit of someone who has made 1,000 beds in their life, and waited. You make your own bed, Mira said finally, not quite a question. I know how, Grace replied. There are people here whose job that is. Their jobs won't disappear because I made mine. Grace straightened and looked at the housekeeper directly. Was there something you needed, Mira? The older woman stepped into the room. She moved with the quiet authority of someone whose domain this was, and Grace felt her assessing gaze moving across the space, noting the neatly arranged herbs on the windowsill, the book of herb lore open on the small table. The gray cloak hung carefully on the peg beside the door. The Lord Edmund has asked for you at breakfast, Mira said, and the Alpha King will be present. Grace nodded. Thank you. Mira did not leave immediately. She stood for a moment longer with her ring of iron keys resting against her hip, and Grace had the clear sense of being on the edge of something, of a sentence that hadn't been spoken yet. I have served this keep for 19 years, Mira said at last. Her voice was careful, even. I have seen many things come through those gates. People arriving with purpose, with ambition, with agendas they believed were hidden. She paused. I am very good at reading people. I imagine you are, Grace said. I have not yet decided what I think of you. Grace held her gaze. That seems reasonable, she said. You don't know me. Something moved in Mira's expression. The faintest recalibration, the same one Grace had seen on the first night, when she had refused to be either cowed or combative. No, the older woman said. I don't. She turned toward the door. Breakfast is in the East Hall. Don't be late. She left. Grace turned back to the window. Outside, the snow that had begun falling 3 days ago had settled properly now, laying a clean white covering across the courtyard below. The stable roofs, the bare branches of the old oak that stood at the center of the yard. A stable boy was crossing the courtyard with a bucket, his boots leaving dark prints in the snow, his breath rising in quick white puffs. She pressed her fingers briefly against the cold glass. Then she reached for her cloak. The East Hall was smaller than she had expected of a king's dining room. A long table of dark oak, 6 chairs along each side and one at the head. A fireplace large enough to stand in burning with serious intent at the far end. The walls were hung with maps, she noticed. Not tapestries. Maps, rendered in careful ink on stretched parchment, pinned and annotated. Some of them marked with what appeared to be territorial boundaries in different colors. The room smelled of wood smoke and tallow, and something warm and yeasty from the kitchen beyond the inner door. Fresh bread, she realized. Actually fresh this time. Edmund was already seated when she arrived, his large hands wrapped around a clay mug of something steaming, a thick wool blanket across his knees despite the fire. He looked better than he had in the way station library 3 days ago. The road weariness had begun to lift from him, leaving behind something steadier. He was still a worn man, still carrying his years, but there was more color in his face and less of that particular hollow quality that comes from cold and insufficient food. He smiled when he saw her. "Grace." "Good morning," she said, and sat down across from him without ceremony. The Alpha King arrived 4 minutes later. She knew it was him before she heard his footsteps. She heard the slight change in the air, a shift in pressure that she couldn't explain rationally but had noticed each time he entered a room. He was wearing a dark tunic today without the full armor, his leather bracers still in place, his braided hair tied back. He looked less like a conquering figure without the fur manto, and more like a man who had been awake for several hours already, which, she suspected, he had been. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at his father first, a quick, evaluating glance that checked something and found it satisfactory, and then looked at Grace. "You slept well?" he asked. It was a perfunctory question, the kind asked by someone for whom social pleasantries are a language learned rather than natural. "I did," she said. "Your east wing is very quiet. It's been unused for several years. It shows care for a wing that hasn't been used. Someone maintained it." A brief pause. "Mira," he said. "She maintains everything." Edmund was watching this exchange with an expression of quiet interest, his mug lifted halfway to his lips, and apparently forgotten there. The bread arrived, fresh as she had hoped, round loaves with a dark crust, accompanied by a small pot of honey and a dish of soft cheese. Grace broke a piece from the nearest loaf and was aware, for a moment, of the particular quality of the silence at the table. Not uncomfortable, not easy either. Something in between, with the texture of two people who have spoken honestly once and are now navigating the distance between that honesty and the ordinary minutes of a day. "There is something I want to ask you," Kyle said. Grace looked up. He was looking at the table in front of him, not at her. One finger moved slowly along the grain of the wood, a small, almost unconscious motion. "You've been here 4 days. You haven't asked for anything. You haven't made requests about your position or your duties. You haven't—" He paused. "Most people, when they arrive here, want something specific. They make it known. I was brought here to be rewarded for an act of ordinary kindness," Grace said. "I wasn't aware I was supposed to have ambitions beyond that. Everyone has ambitions. Everyone has hopes," she corrected gently. "Ambitions are something different." He looked at her then. That direct, unguarded look. "What's the difference?" She considered this for a moment. Outside the high window, snow was falling again, lightly, the flakes moving sideways in a wind that had come up since morning. "An ambition," she said slowly, "is something you pursue regardless of what it costs others. A hope is something you carry quietly and try to deserve." Edmund made a small sound that was not quite a cough. Cale studied her. The firelight moved across the angles of his face, and she noticed again that tiredness, not physical, something deeper. The tiredness of someone who has been carrying weight for a very long time without putting it down. "What do you hope for?" he asked. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was entirely sincere. The question of someone who genuinely wanted to know, who had perhaps forgotten to ask such things and was remembering slowly that they were possible. She looked at the piece of bread in her hands. "Something simple," she said. "To be useful in a way that matters. To understand the place I'm in." She paused. "To not feel like a stranger in every room I enter." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Fuller. "You don't look like a stranger," Edmund said quietly, from across the table. You look like someone who has always known how to belong to a place, and simply hasn't been given one that deserved her. Grace felt the words land somewhere she hadn't expected. Her throat tightened briefly, and she directed her attention firmly to the bread in her hands. It was Corin who first warned her. He found her in the herb garden, a walled courtyard on the south side of the keep, where someone had once grown medicinal plants with serious intent, though it had been largely untended in recent years. Grace had discovered it on her second day and had been spending her mornings there, assessing what remained, what could be salvaged from the frost, what would need replanting come spring. It gave her something useful to do with her hands, which helped her think. Corin appeared at the garden gate with his shoulders slightly hunched and his freckled face carrying an expression of reluctant duty. He glanced back down the corridor before speaking. "There's talk," he said, low, careful. Grace didn't look up from the frost-stiffened rosemary she was examining. There's always talk. This is specific talk. He came a few steps into the garden. About you. About why the king brought you here. He paused. There are people in this keep who have their own ideas about that. People who have been positioned for a long time to be close to the king, who have interests in who does and doesn't have his attention. Grace straightened slowly and looked at him. Who? Corin hesitated. Lord Cedric, he said finally. The king's second advisor. He has a daughter. She's been at the keep for 2 years. He shifted his weight. He's invested a great deal in that arrangement. And he is not... Another pause. He is not a patient man when things don't go as he intends. Grace absorbed this. The cold air of the garden pressed around her, sharp with the smell of frost and old earth, and the ghost of the lavender that had grown here in warmer seasons. I'm not here to interfere with anyone's arrangements, she said. I know that, Corin said. But Lord Cedric doesn't. She turned the information over carefully. An advisor with a daughter positioned near the king, a man accustomed to controlling proximity and access. And now, an unknown maid from a minor estate, brought to the keep on the personal request of the king's father, placed in the east wing, invited to the private breakfast table. She could see, very clearly, how that would look to such a man. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. Corin nodded. He started to go, then stopped. Be careful of the south corridor after the evening meal, he said. That's where Cedric walks. He likes to... He seemed to search for the word. He likes to have conversations where no one else is present. He left. Grace looked down at the rosemary in her hand, the small, stiff leaves, the clean, sharp smell of it, medicinal and grounding. She had handled difficult men before, but she had a feeling that Lord Cedric was going to be something more specific than difficult. And she had a feeling, settled and cold and clear in her chest, that whatever was building inside the walls of Ironvale Keep had only just begun to move. The south corridor was exactly as Corin had described, long and narrow, lit by torches set too far apart so that pools of shadow gathered between each flame. The stone floor was older here than in the rest of the keep, the flags worn unevenly by centuries of feet, and the walls were bare except for a single tapestry halfway down the corridor. A hunting scene. The dyes faded to gray and brown, the hounds frozen mid-leap toward something that had long since lost its color. The corridor connected the great hall to the advisor's wing, and at this hour, after the evening meal, it was consistently empty. Grace walked it deliberately. She had thought carefully about this for 2 days, about Corin's warning, about Lord Cedric, about the particular architecture of the threat being described. A powerful man with a positioned daughter and a long investment in the Alpha King's proximity. A man who had, presumably, spent years constructing an arrangement that served his interests, and who had now watched an unknown woman arrive from nowhere and sit at the private breakfast table within her first week. She understood men like Cedric. She had encountered versions of them throughout 11 years of service. Men who moved through the world with the deep conviction that their plans were the natural order of things, and that anyone who disrupted those plans was not simply an inconvenience, but an offense. Men who preferred their conversations to happen in empty corridors where there were no witnesses. She had decided that if Lord Cedric wanted a conversation in an empty corridor, she would give him one on her own terms. At a time she chose, with her own mind clear and her own feet steady beneath her. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were measured and deliberate. A man who walked as a performance, each step communicating that he was not hurrying and never needed to. He came around the far end of the corridor and stopped when he saw her, and in the half-second before he arranged his expression, she caught it. A flash of surprise, followed immediately by something colder. Calculation. Lord Cedric was a tall man in his middle 50s, with silver hair swept back from a sharp face and the kind of lean, maintained build that spoke of a man who considered his physical appearance part of his political toolkit. He wore deep burgundy wool trimmed with dark fur, a heavy signet ring on his right hand. He was, by any measure, an impressive figure. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced to the point of appearing genuine. "The maid from Ashford," he said pleasantly. "Grace, isn't it?" "It is," she said. He moved down the corridor toward her at an unhurried pace, hands clasped loosely behind his back. "I've been hoping for the chance to speak with you. You've been difficult to catch in a quiet moment." "I've been busy," she said. "The herb garden on the south side has been neglected for some time. I've been taking an inventory of what survived the frost." Something flickered in his eyes at this. The mention of usefulness, of a practical purpose for her presence, was clearly not what he had prepared for. "How industrious," he said, with a warmth that didn't touch his eyes. "The keep is lucky to have someone so eager to contribute." "I hope so." He stopped a few paces from her. The torchlight between them was unsteady, and in it, his carefully pleasant expression had a slight instability, like a surface that looked smooth until you were close enough to see the tension beneath it. "I'll be direct," he said, shifting registers smoothly from pleasantness to a kind of collegial frankness, the tone of one reasonable person to another. "You seem like an intelligent woman, Grace, and intelligent women understand context." "I find context very useful," she agreed. "Good." He tilted his head slightly. "Then you'll understand that your presence here, while no doubt well-intentioned on the old lord's part, creates a certain imbalance. Iron Veil. Keep operates on very delicate relationships, years of careful arrangement. The king is a man of great responsibility, and the people around him have been chosen with that responsibility in mind." A pause. "You are, through no fault of your own, a disruption to something that was functioning well." Grace looked at him steadily. "What was it that was functioning so well, my lord?" The pleasantness thinned slightly. "Stability," he said. "Continuity. The kind that comes from established bonds between the keep and its allied families." He let that settle. "My daughter Seraphine has been a companion to this household for 2 years. She is educated, accomplished, and deeply committed to the well-being of this territory. The relationship between her family and the keep is one of mutual benefit and long trust." "She sounds admirable," Grace said. "She is." He took one step closer, not threatening, calibrated. The precise distance of someone making a point without making a scene. "What I am suggesting, Grace, is that a sensible woman, a woman who understands her position and her origins, might recognize that the kindest thing she could do, for everyone involved, is to accept the keep's gratitude graciously and return to a life that suits her." He smiled again. "I could arrange a very comfortable position for you. A household in the eastern settlements. Good work, fair wages, a life that would represent a significant improvement over Ashford Estate. Grace was quiet for a moment. The torch between them guttered in a draft from somewhere above, and the shadows in the corridor lurched and settled. "Lord Cedric," she said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You are suggesting that I leave Ironvale Keep and accept a position you arrange in exchange for... what exactly? Your goodwill?" "In exchange for not making things unnecessarily complicated," he said. "And if I decline?" The smile stayed in place, but something behind it went very still. "I would hate for a misunderstanding to arise about your intentions here," he said softly. "About why precisely a maid with no family connections and no pack standing would be placed in the east wing of a king's keep. People make assumptions, Grace. Assumptions that could be damaging to your reputation, to the old lord's credibility." A pause. "To the king's judgment." There it was. She had known it was coming, and it still landed with a weight she had to consciously absorb. Not for herself. She had lived most of her life without a reputation to protect, and had learned to move through the world without one. But the mention of Edmund, of Cale's judgment, that was where the blade was sharpest. She looked at Lord Cedric for a long, measuring moment. "Thank you for being direct," she said. "I'll think carefully about what you've said." His shoulders relaxed marginally. "Wise," he said. "I thought you were a sensible woman." "I am," she said. "Good night, my lord." She walked back down the corridor without hurrying. She told Edmund the next morning. Not because she needed advice. She had already decided what she was going to do. But because Edmund had been in this keep for years before his long absence, had understood its inner workings as a young man, and was rebuilding that understanding now, and because she had come, in the space of very few days, to trust the quality of his attention. He listened without interrupting. His face didn't change much, but his hands tightened slightly around his mug. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has Cedric been positioning Seraphine?" Corin said 2 years. Edmund nodded slowly. "Cedric has been an advisor to this keep for 12 years, he said. "He was already here before I left." He set down his mug. "He is a man who plans in decades, Grace, not months." "I know. He will not stop at one conversation." "I know that too." Edmund looked at her. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what I came here to do," she said simply. "Be useful, be present, be honest." She paused. "And I'm going to tell Cale." The old man's expression shifted in a way she was beginning to learn to read, a deepening of the lines around his eyes that meant he was feeling something he wasn't going to name directly. "He won't take it well," Edmund said, finding out that someone in his household threatened a guest. "He needs to know what Cedric is," she said quietly. Edmund was silent for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said. "He does." She found Kyle in the map room. He was standing over the great oak table at the room's center, bent over a series of territorial maps weighted at the corners with iron discs, a quill in one hand, and an expression of concentrated thought on his face. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression adjusted. Not quite surprise, something more like readiness, as if some part of him had been expecting her. She told him everything, plainly, without drama, in the same direct way she had told Edmund. She watched his face as she spoke, and saw the thing behind it change. Not the surface, which stayed controlled, but something in his eyes, a cold quality entering them that was different from his usual stillness. Something with an edge to it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "He threatened Edmund's credibility," Cale said. His voice was entirely level. "Yes." "And my judgment." "Yes." He set the quill down carefully on the table. It was such a controlled motion, so deliberate, that it communicated more than shouting would have. He looked at the maps in front of him without seeing them. "Cedric has been in this keep since before I took the title," he said. "He has made himself indispensable through information and arrangement. He knows where every alliance is anchored." A pause. "He counted on that making him untouchable." "Men like him usually do," Grace said. He looked up at her. The ice-pale eyes were very direct. "You could have left," he said. "He offered you a way out, a comfortable one." "He offered me a way to disappear," she said. "That's different." Something moved across his face. That same quality she had seen in the firelight at the way station. Briefly, unexpectedly human. "Why didn't you take it?" She held his gaze. "Because it would have been dishonest," she said. "And because—" She stopped for a moment, finding the right words. "Because Edmund walked a winter road alone to find you. And whatever Cedric thinks is at stake here, what is actually at stake is whether a father and his son get the time they should have had 7 years ago." She paused. "I won't be the reason that gets complicated." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Cale looked at her for what felt like a very long time. She didn't look away. "My father was right about you," he said finally. His voice was quiet. Something in it had changed. Not softened exactly, but opened. Like a door that had been closed for a very long time, moving slightly on its hinges. She didn't ask what Edmund had said. She had the sense that it was something she wasn't quite ready to hear yet, and that was all right. Some things deserved to be approached slowly. "What will you do about Cedric?" she asked instead. "What I should have done a long time ago," he said. "Look at what's actually there, rather than what's useful." Cedric was summoned to the Great Hall 3 days later. Grace was not present for the meeting. She learned what happened from Corin, who had been standing at the door and whose freckled face carried the expression of someone who had witnessed something they would be describing for years. Cale had laid out, calmly and with precise detail, the evidence of Cedric's arrangements. Not just the corridor conversation with Grace, but a pattern of controlled access, manipulated information, and diverted messages that Mira, it turned out, had been quietly documenting for 18 months. The housekeeper, Grace would later understand, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Had been waiting, in fact, for someone to provide the opening. Cedric had denied it, then rearranged, then attempted the same collegial frankness he had used in the corridor. It had not worked on Cale the way it had been designed to. He was stripped of his advisory position, his keep quarters, and his right to conduct business within the territory's central lands. His daughter Seraphine, who had known nothing of her father's machinations, and was, by all accounts, a young woman who had been as much a piece on his board as anyone else, was given the choice to remain at the keep in an honest capacity or return to her family's estate. She chose to leave. Grace thought, privately, that she had probably been wanting to leave for a long time. On the last evening before the winter solstice, Grace found Edmund in the library again, but this time he was not alone. Cale was sitting in the chair across from him, not at the head of a table, not at the center of a room, but simply in a chair, close to a fire, his elbows on his knees and his braided hair loose around his shoulders. They were talking, not formally, just talking, the way two people talk when they have remembered that they know how to. She stood at the threshold for a moment, not wanting to interrupt. Edmund saw her first. He tilted his head slightly toward the empty chair beside the fire, an invitation. She came in quietly and sat down. For a while none of them spoke, and the fire burned between them, and the snow fell outside the library window, and the keep was warm. "I owe you an apology," Kyle said eventually. He was looking at the fire. "For the East Wing, for not explaining what you were walking into when I brought you here." "You didn't fully know yourself," Grace said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. But I should have thought more carefully about what it would look like, about who it would disturb. He paused. I brought you here because my father asked me to, and because... He stopped, seemed to reconsider. Because when he described you, I wanted to understand what kind of person you were. And have you? She asked. He looked at her then. The firelight moved in his pale eyes. Yes, he said, simply. Edmund was looking at the window. His expression was the quietest she had ever seen it, peaceful in a way that was different from resignation, that was actually, she realized, peace. Real peace. The kind that comes when something long broken has been acknowledged, and the acknowledgement itself has begun the repair. Spring came late to Ironvale Keep, but it came. The herb garden on the south side of the keep was replanted through the cold months in careful stages. Rosemary, sage, yarrow, feverfew, the particular variety of mint that Grace had identified as surviving in the most sheltered corner of the walled space. By the time the frost finally released the ground in earnest, there were green shoots pushing through the dark earth in neat rows, and the garden smelled again the way it had been meant to smell. Clean and sharp and medicinal and alive. Mira came to look at it one morning in early spring, standing at the gate with her iron keys at her hip and her arms crossed, the way she stood when she was thinking seriously about something. "You've done well with this," she said. "It wanted doing," Grace replied. She was kneeling at the edge of a bed, pressing small seedlings into the loosened earth with careful fingers. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different register, quieter, the formal flatness set aside. "I want you to know that I watched you carefully when you first arrived. I was not welcoming." "You were honest," Grace said. "That's more useful." Something in Mira's face settled into a new arrangement. The beginning, Grace thought, of something that might become trust, given enough ordinary mornings like this one. Edmund walked every day now. The road weariness had left him entirely, replaced by a steadiness that suited him. The steadiness of a man who had come home and decided to stay. He walked the keep's corridors, sat in the library, ate at the table with his son in the evenings. The conversations between father and son were not always easy. There were hard things that needed to be said, things that had been waiting 7 years in the cold, and saying them was slow and sometimes painful. But they were being said. That was what mattered. Corin had taken to stopping by the herb garden in the mornings on his way to the stables, offering opinions on the plantings that revealed he knew more about herbs than a king's guard had any particular reason to know. Grace let him help with the heavier work and did not ask where the knowledge came from. Some things were better received than interrogated. And Kyle came to the garden on a morning in late spring when the light was doing something extraordinary, coming through the gap in the east wall in a long warm shaft that made the new green of the garden luminous. Grace was standing at the center of it, her hands dirty to the wrist, her braid over one shoulder, looking up at something, a bird that had landed on the wall, and was regarding her with the frank curiosity of a creature that had decided she was not a threat. He stood at the gate for a moment before she heard him. When she turned, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled assessment of their first meeting, not the complex tiredness of the way station fire, not the cold precision of the map room. Something quieter than all of those. Something that had been there for a while, she suspected, working its way gradually toward the surface. He came into the garden, stopped near her. "My father says you're planning to stay," he said. "Your father talks too much," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was small, as it always was, but it was real. It was, she had come to understand, the way he smiled. Not widely, not easily, but with the full weight of meaning behind it. "He does," Cale agreed. He looked at the garden around them, the neat rows, the green shoots, the wall with its gap where the morning light came through. "It looks different," he said. "This place. It just needed attention," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "It did." The bird on the wall shifted, considered, and flew away into the spring morning. Grace looked at the man standing in the garden of his own keep, with his hands loose at his sides and his pale eyes warm for the first time since she had known him, and she thought of an old man sitting in a frost-covered yard with his palms open and upward, waiting to see what the world would do next. She thought she understood now what Edmund had meant, that first morning in the library. "This keep has been cold for a very long time, and I thought perhaps it was time for that to change." It was changing. Not in great dramatic gestures, not in proclamations or ceremonies or the loud language of kingdoms, but in small, solid, real things. In a father and son sitting by a fire and saying the hard words, in a housekeeper standing at a garden gate and beginning to let her guard down, in a young guard who knew too much about herbs and had no one to talk to about it, in green things pushing through cold earth because someone had decided they deserved to grow, in a man who had forgotten how to smile, slowly, carefully, remembering. Grace pressed the last seedling into the dark earth and sat back on her heels and looked up at the wide spring sky above the keep's walls. She was not a stranger here anymore. She was not a maid waiting to be useful in whatever way was asked of her. She was simply here, needed, and knowing it, belonging and feeling it. Herself, completely, in a place that had finally become large enough to hold her. That was enough. That was, she thought, everything. Edmund lived out his remaining years at Ironvale Keep, close to his son, in the library where the morning light was best. He died 3 winters later in his sleep, in the leather chair by the window, with a book open on his lap and the sound of the valley below him through the glass. Cale sat with him until morning. Corin was eventually promoted to head of the King's Guard, a role he performed with complete dedication and occasional, entirely unofficial commentary on the state of the South Garden's mint supply. Mira kept her iron keys for the rest of her life, and was never heard to say an unkind word about Grace again, which those who knew her well understood to be the highest compliment in her considerable vocabulary. And Grace remained at Ironvale Keep through every season that followed. Not as a maid, not as a guest, but as herself. The woman who had fed a hungry old man 2-day-old bread and shown him a warm place to sleep, and in doing so had quietly, completely changed everything.